This podcast is dedicated to the Dakota. We honor those who care for the land on which our building and its community is built. Thank you. Welcome back to the Students Co-op Memory Journal. It's the holiday season in the waning days of 2021, and this is episode 3. Former co-op resident Ian reached out to me and has been keeping us in touch with his old housemate Mark. Together, we've been talking about the house as it was 2 to 3 decades prior to now, and I'm going to curate our discussions into a few episodes, so let's begin. Travel back to the 1990s, as recalled with Ian and Mark. Let's introduce ourselves before we get started, if that's all right with you. And just because I am the host, I'll go first real quick. My name is Maxime. I don't have preferred pronouns. You can use any of them. That's fine. I lived at the Students Co-op from March 2011 to roughly October 2015, although I moved out a couple times. And today we have with us, well, let's hear from them.
Sure. This is Ian Morris. I was at the co-op from 94 to 97. And during that time, I was house manager for a while. So I had that experience. Yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk about other details as we go.
My name is Mark Ambro, and I was there from 1992 through 2002. I think it would have been probably September of 92 through December of 2002. So, yeah, I saw a whole bunch of different, I guess, cohorts, you could call them, and phases of the co-op's sort of governance, being pretty skeletal and minimal when I first moved into 92 to being, really involved, by the time I moved out in 2002. And that just continued after I moved out too, and even got, I think, more involved. I had quite a lot of seniority. I mean, by the time I left, but I wasn't the longest serving person at that point. There was another person who had been there a lot longer that wasn't quite as involved, but was very much a remembered personality, and we can get into those details. They're kind of fun to talk about, but I count those as very formative years for me. I learned an awful lot about myself and about getting along with other people, and a lot of logistics. Gave me some career skills that have, been largely responsible for my current job here at the university. For what it's worth, I work in Falwell Hall, which is across the street and down the block from the co-op. So I'm very close by.
Wow. Well, since we're already on your story, why don't we ask you how you first found out about the co-op?
That's a great question. I'd love to talk a lot about that. I'll tell you that feel free to cut me off if I'm getting, to be, too long.
Oh, I will.
Too far details. Okay. So I went to school initially in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Well, I graduated from high school in 1988, and I went to Ann Arbor for a couple of years and became very good friends with a fellow student in a way at the University of Michigan who called me up a few years later. I ended up transferring back to Minnesota. I grew up here. I grew up in Bloomington. And so I went out of state to go to Michigan. And after 2 years in Ann Arbor, I got a little homesick, and, it was exorbitantly expensive compared to in-state tuition in Minnesota. So I transferred back, and I was taking classes at the University of Minnesota, living off campus. And my friend from the University of Michigan called me up and said, I was accepted into a PhD program at the University of Minnesota. You want to help me find a place to live? And I was like, sure, great to see you. Come on over, and we can look around Dickeytown or wherever. And so he met me, and he had lived at a co-op in Ann Arbor, the home to NASCO, for at least, I want to say, 1 or 2 years, and was comfortable with it. So we wanted to find a co-op if there was one around here.
Can you break down very briefly for the audience what NASCO is? They might not be aware.
North American Students of Cooperation, overreaching umbrella organization for a lot of student housing co-ops, probably other kinds of co-ops too now throughout North America. And their headquarters are in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There were a lot of housing co-ops there. And there had been some very loose exchanges, I think, with NASCO over the years to the Students Co-op at the University of Minnesota, but the relationship did not exist at the time. But he knew he wanted to live in a co-op, and so he ended up that spring of 92, he he put a deposit in, and I kind of filed it away in my mind. And later in the summer, I still didn't have a place to live, and so I checked back at the Students Co-op. The recruitment manager gave me a tour of the place, said there was still a single available, and did I want it? Yes, I did. So I ended up moving in September, but always had a little bit less seniority than my friend Nick, who had put his deposit in 6 months earlier. And he, when it came time to choose house jobs or whatever, he always had a little bit more seniority than me, and that was always kind of a going joke.
Did he explain how that worked, seniority, or was it kind of just like, oh, well, you better get in on this, or what?
No, I think that, and again, I'm guessing this is a long time ago, the explanation of seniority and house jobs probably came during orientation when I moved in. Probably Nick moved in a couple months before me. It was kind of common, I think, for graduate students, particularly first-year grad students, to move in a few months before the classes started. So he probably moved in July or August. No, the first year, probably even 2 that I lived there, I was taking classes myself, and I think I had hallways and stairs, or I think I cleaned bathrooms. That was like the lowest seniority job. So I was.
That's awesome. How did you, Ian, find out about the co-op?
I had a friend, Maggie, and we were both in the Journalism Association. We were journalism students. We were in the SPJ, Society of Professional Journalists. And she had asked me for help in moving from an apartment she had in the West Bank. This was probably 93. And so I became familiar with it through helping her move. And then about a year later, I moved out of an apartment building, spent some time back in Seattle, came back to Minnesota, and didn't have a specific place planned to live. And she suggested I check out the co-op and maybe stay there for a while. And I applied and got in, and it became not a temporary thing at all, but someplace I stayed for 3 years and really enjoyed being.
That's awesome. All right, so explain what your impressions were or thoughts about the house were before you moved in.
I was aware of the house long before I even helped Maggie move in. It's on Frat Row. There was always a sign that said Students Co-op. It didn't look like the frats on either side. You could tell it was something different. And, the building, I don't want to sound negative, but the building always looked a little bit, it wasn't kept up like some of the better funded frats. It always looked a little bit on the edge. And so I was always kind of curious about what kind of place it was.
What were the visual hints that told you that this might be a little unkempt or a little bit less funded?
I remember the sign specifically. There was kind of a hand-painted sign, like on a piece of plywood, that said Students Co-op. It wasn't an expensive sign, and I think it was several years old, and the paint was peeling a little bit.
Was that just leaning against the railing, or where was that displayed?
I think it was posted. I think it was on posts, but it just looked something like students had done. It contrasted with some of the frats that obviously had some money and tradition and had a way of doing things that made their houses look really nice. So it didn't look bad necessarily, but it looked a little bit haphazard. Maybe that's the way to put it.
Was the bicycle up there at the time that you moved?
No,
that came later. Okay.
I think the bike went up when we were there. The bike wasn't there. But my first impression was probably not a positive impression. I lived in the
That's
dorms.
honest.
I lived in the dorms, and the dorms were well run. Everything was clean and well maintained. And
I didn't have any impressions before, my friend Nick ended up deciding that's where he wanted to live. And I was really good friends with Nick, and he's an exceptionally bright person with a judgment that I really trusted a lot. And one thing I didn't sort of mention is that we were both athletes at the University of Michigan. We were both gymnasts. And so I was transitioning out of gymnastics at that time. I was actually on the Gopher Gymnastics varsity team, and I had just made a decision to not continue with that, focus more on studies. And I was in a kind of a difficult period of trying to find a new social group, find my footing in a different discipline. And this seemed like a really good community to continue that search within. And I had some experience in high school on the West Bank at a kind of a funky vegetarian restaurant called the New Riverside Cafe. So I knew of that place. and this had a similar kind of vibe to it. I was also probably familiar with North Country Co-op at the time because it was located over on the West Bank at 22nd Avenue in Riverside. And I had probably shopped there a little bit. So that was a grocery co-op, and the cafe, the Riverside Cafe, was a sort of a restaurant co-op, and here was a housing co-op. So I was kind of like putting the puzzle together in all of these ways to find a new social group and a new place to kind of start finding my way. There were not any varsity athletes at all in the student co-op, and that was very appealing to me because that had been my reference point for years. I mean, 15 years prior to that. I mean, it was going back to junior high, even elementary school, and now I was kind of looking for a different scene.
So for you, it was very exciting, and for Ian, maybe it was just like practical.
Yes. I needed a place to stay, and it seemed good enough. I didn't think I would stay there for a long time, but then, as I say, my feelings changed.
When I moved in, I was working really hard. I had declared a major by that point. Again, sort of with Nick's influence, he was in the PhD program in math at the U. I had declared math as an undergraduate major, and I was sort of in my upper level phase of that, doing pretty well and having some success. But I was very focused on classes. I really didn't have any aspirations to do management. You know, I was doing my part as far as house jobs and enjoying the culture of the place, but I didn't really see it as a place that I was going to stay. And that was my role. And I just kind of, you know, was observing how the place ran and developing friendships and sharing my interest and my sort of talents. You know, I was really into cycling a lot, and there were always people that, you know, had bikes that needed to be worked on or had questions about how to work on bikes. And
oh, that's great. It's so nice that both of you had, in a way, a friend connection, even if, you know, Nick wasn't living there at the time. There was it's almost like you were invited there, which makes me want to ask you both, what was the application process like? Do you feel there was a little bit of cronyism, you know, like, hey, I know you, so you get in, or was there a voting process?
Sure. I think that the application process was instituted after I moved in, and I don't know if it was, you know, it would have been between 92 and 94 because Ian recalls applying. Jeff was the recruitment manager, and he gave me a tour and said there was availability, and I didn't even fill out an application. I'm almost sure I didn't.
Wow.
It was kind of just, I think it was just the judgment of the recruitment managers to whether or not this would fit. And I didn't know Jeff at all. I think I did mention that, you know, my friend Nick had, you know, put a deposit down and he was going to be moving in, or maybe he was there already. But so I may have had that as a little bit of a reference, but I did not fill out the application. The application, I remember there was a big discussion about, you know, what questions should be asked. And Jeff, who was the recruitment manager, who really, I think, oversaw that application process and the voting process that we went through. I don't think I was accepted by a voting process of the House. Very shortly after that, I think we started voting on the applications because there ended up being a lot of applications, and there was, you know, I think that the management was a little bit more insular coming out of the 80s. And by the time the new group kind of came in, there was some more desire for more egalitarian. And so then we started doing this. Everybody needed to vote on the various applications that were submitted.
So they were like, hey, who is this Mark guy and how did he get in here? We got to start an application process.
Yeah. And I don't remember, you know, maybe we can get some better answers to when and why we started doing applications. But at the time I got in, I don't remember filling out any applications or having anybody, you know, question why I got in. And I don't remember that there was a person who was questionable and therefore we had to start screening.
You know, Mark, I think over time we just ended up with so many applications that it became a burden for the recruitment manager to make a decision on all these people that were showing up. And people would show up and talk to somebody and they would tell the recruitment manager, oh, there was this guy. Eventually you had to have something you could give people that said, you know, fill this out, you know, we're going to, before some number of weeks before the start of the quarter, we're going to, make a decision and we'll let you know. And as Mark is suggesting, later in my time, it became a very formal process with, fairly comprehensive applications. I remember, sitting there, very sincerely reading them all and thinking about what I was reading and what people I thought would be a good fit and what people wouldn't. It became a big deal. But that process really came into place after I got there. I think I filled something out, but it was largely still Jeff, the same guy, the same recruitment manager, Jeff's decision about who was a good fit and who wasn't. So and he let me know very shortly after I spoke to him. I think there was a space, and he thought I was good enough, and he gave it to me.
So, Mark, you wouldn't have voted on Ian's application, because you moved in 92 and Ian moved in 94. So just a couple years later. So I'm assuming that the application process kind of wasn't even installed at the time.
I think Ian's right in that I didn't vote on Ian's. I certainly don't remember voting on Ian's in particular. I remember voting on a lot of them. There was a person who took over recruiting from Jeff. It was a woman who had moved in, if I'm remembering the succession pretty right, and she was amazing. She just took the recruitment. She, I think, maybe even done a team with another person for a little while, but I think she was the one who kind of started the application process in order to make it more fair and take some of the burden off of the recruitment manager for making these decisions and being sort of the gatekeeper and influencing a lot of the culture of the co-op. And it was just sort of the desire to make it like everybody's, sort of set up a system of, okay, well, the stack of applications will be down in the kitchen. You're going to have a week to look through them. Please, everybody look through them and give us your rank voting. And then I'll get back to the applicants and let them know whether they're in or not. And I think, the first phase of Jeff being there, because Jeff was there at a couple of different times. I mean, he traveled, I think, in between. So his first phase was he was doing the recruitment manager a lot more like informally. And I think the housing market changed a lot. I remember, the mid to late 90s, the housing market was just such that we always had way more applicants than there were spaces available. In the earlier 90s, it may not have been the case. Fine.
Do you want to speculate at all about why that might have been the case?
I think I would be out of my element in speculating about that. I know that housing fluctuated a lot, and I had a good friend who, said somewhere around those times and that she was really having trouble finding an apartment. She had to go to St. Paul. I mean, she was working in Minneapolis, but she had to go to St. Paul to find an apartment, and she could not get housing in Minneapolis at all. And that was at the time where I was living at the co-op, and I was feeling incredibly lucky because our rent was really low. Yet we had all of these applications. We very easily could have raised rent a lot and took in more money at that time. I don't know if that had been the case earlier in the 90s, like in 92. I kind of don't think so. I consider myself fairly in tune with a lot of that now because I live in South Minneapolis, and I kind of live a political junkie, so I follow all the issues that the city is dealing with, or a lot of the issues the city is dealing with. And I know that housing in the last couple of years has been a really big issue to the point where we had a city charter question, trying to address whether or not to explore rent control. Or
not to get too sidetracked, but what is rent control?
Okay, so that's kind of an urban housing, mostly urban housing policy that goes way back, like 50 plus, maybe even more than 50 years. And big cities generally kind of have a policy about rent can't increase more than a certain amount every year in order to make housing affordable to lower income people. There's a huge debate about whether or not rent control works. And there's old versions of rent control, and then there's new 21st century versions of rent control that give exceptions for new development, where developer can kind of raise rents a little bit in the first few years in order to recover some costs, and that's considered a little bit more friendly to development. But it's a contentious issue, and Minneapolis has never really had rent control, to my knowledge, whereas big cities like Chicago and New York have, with varying degrees of success or failure. And so the questions have come to Minneapolis and the metro area of St. Paul as well. And there were ballot questions just this last election cycle around rent control that would have changed the city charter in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. And both of them passed. And Minneapolis's was a little bit weaker in the sense that what passed was just this policy to explore the possibility of rent control. Whether or not it gets implemented is another question.
Wow, yeah, that's very cautious.
Yes, and in St. Paul, the ordinance that passed was much stricter. It capped increases at 3% annually, and now there's a whole bunch of questions about, like, maybe we're going to have to amend this and change it somehow. And right now, Minneapolis is, I think, in a much better position where we can kind of look at how well the strict version in St. Paul that passed works out and change ours accordingly.
Yeah, I live in Seattle, and it's the same. I mean, these big cities that have a lot of jobs and are attractive places to live. Seattle, Minneapolis, San Francisco. The housing is a crisis. There's a lot of things that contribute to that. It's harder and harder to develop. One of the problems here in Seattle, I know that's a problem in San Francisco. And so, this challenge of balancing, maintaining the character of neighborhoods with making sure there's places for people to live. These are hard problems.
Yes. And I'd like to, actually, I've got 3 questions kind of floating in my mind. Hope you don't mind if we kind of try to cover them briefly. And it has to do with demographics as well as rent. Do you remember an exact price for rent that we're talking about here?
At the co-op?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember the rates pretty well. I mean, one of the roles that I sort of ended up moving into was the treasurer position. After a couple of years of being there, I was recruited to take over the treasurer duties from the person who had done it for several years at that point. And I agreed. So I ended up having to keep it in the front of my head what the rates on the various rooms were.
Tell us the rates. Tell us the rates.
Oh, sure. Okay. All right. I think on the low end, it was, if you were in a double, I think $155 per month.
Nice.
Now, okay, it depended on whether or not you paid month to month versus whether you paid 3 months at a time.
Whoa. Okay, so you had payment plans.
Yep. Yeah. In fact, I think that there were at a certain point there may have even been there was a deduction for paying 3 months at a time, and then there was even a deeper deduction for paying either 6 or 12 months at a time, like a full year. And then there were always people that paid month to month. So it was really pretty complicated for the accounts receivable person or the treasurer person to keep track of.
Some people that are on scholarships or have a housing allowance as part of their tuition program. So if you have a scholarship and you're being paid by somebody else to go to school, one of the things you have is a housing allowance, and you'll get that payment at the beginning of the quarter or the semester or whatever. And
From who? Who's giving you that? You?
If you get a scholarship from the university, if you have an athletic scholarship, although that wasn't a big thing at the co-op, people have various situations where they're being helped out with school, right?
Yeah, and generally those kind of funds probably flow into a personal bank account, and then you're paying for your rent out of your personal bank account. So it wasn't like we were dealing with the university or some outside entity that was funding a scholarship. That's not to my recollection anyway. Funding, payments came from individuals, but they may have been given a certain allotment of money, like a housing allowance.
And so for them, why would they want to make 3 payments when they've been already paid up front? And so, the co-op benefited from having that payment up front and not having to collect rent every month from that person.
Or for those 3 months. And then we didn't have to think about them for another period of time. And then it also, I think we were kind of like on a month to month, so if somebody wanted to move out right away, then, maybe they didn't do the 3 months or the 6 months, but if they were pretty sure that they liked it and they were going to stay for that whole academic year, then they would do the payment for 6 months at a time. It was pretty complicated to keep track of all of that.
Hey, Mark, when you were there, I remember you put up a chart every month that had all the rooms, who was in it, the rate for the room, and it also showed what the status of the rent was for that room. So if somebody was not paying, it was posted on the inside of the door for everyone to see. That was interesting. So that was an interesting dynamic. You couldn't really hide if you were not contributing financially for your room.
This is just a little side story, but in my era, that all went into like a discrete place in the accounting, until it came to be a problem that a couple people were not paying rent, and so we actually proposed at a meeting, you know what? Let's just show who is or is not, and it solved the problem instantly.
Yeah. I'm a big proponent of that. There's sort of a theme in the co-op of conflict and discomfort, versus organization and order and rules. And this is a really good example. There's a lot of people who would suggest, oh, let's not put somebody on the spot. But if you do that, and if you're fair to everybody and everyone's treated the same, it puts good pressure on people to hold up their end of the deal.
So that brings me to, so let's say you're paying $150 a month, and we're not talking about meals or anything like that. And then some people can pay $450 for a quarter.
Like going back to the rates, so I remember it being $155 for a kind of like I think those were the less desirable doubles, and then there were $185 doubles, and then there were I think there was a $205 single, and then there was a $245 single. So maybe 4 different levels: $155, $185 for the singles or for the doubles, and then $205 and $245 for the singles. 4 different rates for the rooms.
Was the high rate for room 18 with the 3 big windows on the third floor?
No, that was always a double. In fact, I was in that room for a little while. At the end of the hall on the 3rd floor. Yeah.
Yes, I was never in that room. I was right next to that room. Yes, interesting.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the big single was, I want to say room 6, because Maggie was in that room for a period of time.
Room 6. That was my room. That was my room, and that was a double when I was there. Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
With my good buddy Charlie.
I could be wrong on the number. Yeah, but there were a couple rooms that got nicely renovated, and they went for the higher single rate of $245. What I called the sort of the acorn single, a small single on the 1st floor, right across from the bathroom in the back of the house. Really small little single. I was there for a long, long time, and that was, I think, $205.
I think that's still a single, or was recently.
Okay. Yeah, I can't imagine that there would be 2 people crammed into that. I think I was really tight for one person. You got $5 off per month if you paid 3 months at a time. You got $5 off. If you paid 6 months at a time, I think it was $10 off per month.
Wow, that's cool.
So those were the deductions, and there would always be, like on this chart, like by the time I kind of started doing treasurer things, let's say by 94 or 95. I had, a column for the base rent, and then any deductions for, a bulk payment, any upcharges for a meal plan, which kind of came along, any, credits for your house job or fines for your house job, and then a final amount due for that month, and then a running balance. So that's kind of what my manual, I didn't use computers for spreadsheets. I just kind of used a ruler and pencil, and I made my own little grid spreadsheets out of paper.
And that's work intensive.
And it was very work intensive, but I was kind of like, I didn't mind it. I kind of liked it, I guess. And, so my rent charts and various reports ended looking very homely like that, with all the numbers added up. And
I really hope we still have those.
Oh, I have a lot of them.
Oh, you do?
I have a lot of them.
Okay.
I do.
Please, if you can scan or photograph those, please. I can delete any sensitive information, but we have to put that in the show notes. That is amazing.
Okay. Yeah. I'll try and dig those out. I'm kind of a little bit of a pack rat, so I've got those things squirreled away. Might take me a little bit of time to find them, but I will. It may not even be useful to people, but it might be fun to look through.
Absolutely.
Mark, one of the things you brought up was fines. Can you talk a little bit about fines at the co-op and what got you a fine?
Well, you being a house manager, Ian, could speak to this pretty well too. But if you were, the dynamic was that sometimes you agreed to do your house job, and for whatever reason, legitimate or not, you couldn't do it, and so then the person who had to do the job the next week would have twice the work. Dishes was a very common one. Dishes had to be done every day, and it was somebody's house job to do the dishes and to kind of clean the kitchen in a basic way, maybe the stove and the sink.
No, sorry to interrupt, Mark. Dishes were a special case because it wasn't a house job that some single person had. It rotated around because it was such a big job. Is that right?
It was a team, so there was like dishes 1 and dishes 2 on a given day.
Okay. Was it weekend dishes that floated? There was some dishes job that floated, and everyone had to do it at some point.
Oh yeah, that's right.
That system actually lasted to. Yeah, I can talk about what happened with the dishes eventually, but that system was what we used when I moved in 2011.
Oh, really? Okay, all right. Well, it was. Where I was kind of going with that is that, if you skipped your house job and you coming the next day, or if you were on weekend dishes and it was your turn or whatever, you might have this massive pile of dishes, massive. And well, it would be appropriate that you got credit for that. So where's your credit going to come from? Well, it's going to come from the fine to the person who didn't do their job. And so in theory, those two offset each other. And it was the job of the house manager to kind of like on a daily or every couple of days basis, kind of go around. Did that person vacuum the hallway the way they were supposed to? Did they do the dishes the way they were supposed to? And if they didn't, well, you get a little fine. If they did, usually it was the responsibility of the person doing the job to say, wow, I had tons of extra dishes, or the carpet was incredibly dirty. I'm requesting a credit. And they would request a credit. And then maybe if the house manager would make a decision about, yes, it was warranted, or maybe we need to discuss this with the board. And usually they were kind of like approved. And so there was this column on the spreadsheet that related to, credits or fines. And that was the primary way that, credits or fines were issued. I mean, I think there were other ways that credits could be issued, like if there was a particularly huge job that was being done and the house manager maybe the maintenance manager had to organize a particularly huge project, or, there was a big, really weird issue that came up that the treasurer had to deal with, that maybe they could request some extra house credit. If the board approved it, that would be discussed at a board meeting and then inserted in that little box for a given month, so that their credit was applied to maybe to that month and then to their ongoing balance. So when I was doing the treasurer, I really tried to make everything super clear, and like Ian said, kind of just put it out there so that everybody knew where everybody stood, and there could be some a little bit of social pressure to hold up your end,
Yeah, actually, that system also lasted. We also had that where we would talk about it at a board meeting. Hey, such and such did a really extra good job. Bathrooms are looking amazing. Let's propose like a bonus for this person, and it's approved. And then it shows, and then the house manager can actually approve that and put it into the system. Yeah. So I'll just run through the positions that we had when I was there in 2012, and maybe you can tell me whether that existed or not. Right. So this is a game. I don't know. So in 2012, in like summer of 2012, we had something called Dish A and Dish B. Okay. That was so that there was always two people in the kitchen working together, but Dish A's job, this was 5 co-opers, one per day of the weekdays, is washing all the dishes except the cast irons once a week. It was actually Sunday through Thursday, but that's just that's because Friday and Saturday, there was weekend dish.
Yep.
And then
that was weekend dishes. Yeah.
And then Dish B was mopping the kitchen and the dining area, cleaning prep tables, dining tables, the ovens, stoves, and the cast irons.
Yeah, exactly. The cast irons, I never remember being part of it, but definitely mopping, sweeping was Dish B. Dish A was actual dishes.
Okay. And then, so that's a total of 10 co-opers. And then 3 co-opers were on bathrooms, mopping the bathrooms, cleaning all the surfaces once a week, Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday.
Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. That sounds reasonable. Sounds right. Like that you would have bathrooms on one of 3 days during the week, either Sunday, Tuesday or Thursday. That sounds right to me. I know I held, that role at various times, and what day of the week I did, I don't remember, but I 3 days out of the week rings a bell with me.
I feel like when I moved in, it might have been Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or something like that, and it shifted a little. But because I feel like I did Wednesday bathrooms when I first moved in. But anyway,
okay.
Then there was 3 car, which is common areas and recycling. So that included mopping the living room, den and porches, and relocating castaway items to the lost and found once a week, and that was 3 days a week.
Okay. Common areas and recycling.
And that's different from halls and stairs. Halls and stairs was just one prized position that was mopping the stairs and vacuuming the halls once a week.
Yeah. Yep. That sounds right. And the common areas and recycling also rings a bell. I'd sort of forgotten about that. I think those are the house jobs. I'm trying to remember if there was anything else, but
garbage.
Garbage. Interesting. Well, we had
part of common areas. Was that part of common areas and recycling?
I feel like garbage was something else. I'm not sure how that actually occurred. That might be common areas, but
I think it was just sort of like the garbage that was in your area. So if there was a garbage can in the common area, it was a common area. If there was garbage in the bathroom, that was the bathroom person. If there was garbage in the kitchen, that was the kitchen person.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yep, that sounds right. So then we had 2 extra ones that we kind of invented. I'm not sure. So one of them was utilities, and that was for organizing the laundry room, the tool room, and turning the compost bin. And the reason we developed that one was because the laundry room would often get a mess, and we would have clothing items that we didn't know who they belonged to. And so there was and people would start laundry and then forget it. And so we had a way to sort of transition laundry out of the laundry room in stages by moving laundry from, it's in the waiting bin, and then it's in the throwaway bin, and then it's just thrown away or donated.
Yeah.
And then the other invention was food prep. And that was because people got so busy. We didn't have a supper club really much. So just 3 hours per week, this person was making beans, rice, veggie burgers, and other basic ingredients for the meal plan. So if you're on the meal plan, you could just help yourself to pre-prepped food items that would save you time, and you don't have to turn on the rice maker. You just scoop the rice out of the fridge.
And that was separate from the food manager position, it sounds like.
Yes. So then the manager positions were 2 maintenance managers whose jobs were, that was me and my roommate for a while, which was pretty funny because it was room 6 was the maintenance manager's room. We oversaw work weekends, incentivized and motivated co-opers to get their general hours done, identified and prioritized projects, liaisoned with the contractors, and I think actually house manager liaisoned with fraternity partners or FPA, because they were the ones that could get the towels and the rags kind of circulated, dirty out, clean in. But maintenance manager also had to know a thing about power tools, because if no one else was doing things, maintenance managers ended up doing those things. And then we had 2 food managers whose job was to buy food for everyone. And I don't know why that became 2, but I think it just became, it was very time consuming. People are busy, they're at school. And so, just to take the time to go and shop and pile up things and buy so many things and then bring it back, put it all in the fridges, store it. It was just very time consuming. And because there was a constant demand for food, having 2 food managers really helped in visiting Co-op Partners Warehouse. And also it eventually transitioned into things like dumpster diving, and found food and things like that to kind of reduce the need for a bigger budget. Then there was president. house manager, whose like side title was vice president. I don't know if you had that.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You know what? I think there was the vice president was the same as the treasurer. When I was kind of recruited into the treasurer position, I think that the treasurer was kind of the default vice president.
Okay. That makes sense.
But I don't remember that role really. Like you say, that might have floated around to house manager later on, but I don't think the vice president was really had specific duties that I can recall.
Then there was treasurer, and they were. So it was interesting because I think we had financial manager and treasurer as separate duties.
Yeah. Yep, definitely. And that I think dated from when I kind of said, "Hey, I need some help here." So when I got the job, it was accounts payable and accounts receivable, and then I split it up into, accounts payable being the treasurer and accounts receivable being the financial manager.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah, I think finances was also kind of like how things were happening in the house, even though the house manager was like, we're issuing this fine or credit, the financial manager would actually budget that out.
Yes, exactly. I was just getting when Ian had that job, I was just getting slips from him, and I was entering them in my little, my grid spreadsheet.
Your hand-drawn papers.
Hand-drawn papers, yeah. And I didn't have to make any judgments. I got that from the house manager. But as a financial manager, I just took that information and did with it what I need to do to create those billing statements or whatever.
That's awesome. Okay,
and then pretty soon that turned into two different people. There was a treasurer and then a financial manager at a certain point. But for a while, I was kind of doing both jobs.
Cool. Thank you for that. And then the last three were secretary, and I had that for a while, which was taking meeting minutes. And I would like draw cartoons on the side to make people read them. And we had this policy of posting the meeting minutes in the 3 bathrooms so that people were kind of reading them in the bathroom.
That's good.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And then recruitment manager was separate. They were kind of orientation as well, right? I mean, we didn't have an Oreo manager. So recruitment was find people, like hopefully that person actually attends the university. So they actually are there to be like, hey, we can like post things. We need people. But they also would encourage applications and encourage people to read the applications that are submitted and encourage everyone to vote on them so that they could make like a decent, valuation of whether people were paying attention to who was coming into the house or not. Because we did have to evict at least one person, I remember, for substance abuse and stealing. And then the last one was archives or alumni manager, and that was someone who worked with the secretary to keep historic records of the house, which I think we only had that for it felt like it was like kind of coming and going for a year. We were like, do we need this position? Yes, we need this position because this is like institutional knowledge that we're preserving. No, we don't need it because we have a little manager office. We don't need a person. So I'm not even sure if archives or alumni manager even exists or ever existed again after that.
Mark, maybe can you talk a little bit about board meetings? People obviously would show up to argue their case, but beyond that, was there a lot of house attendance, or was it just the officers doing their business at the board meetings?
Well, I remember, we had pretty good attendance from the officers, meaning the president and the treasurer and the recruitment manager and the house manager. Then if there was an issue that a person had, they would kind of show up during that maybe 2-hour period. I think we tried to keep those meetings that I think would be between 1 and 2 hours. And they were monthly, I think. And the person who had their issue, might show up and then take off. But I remember them being pretty regular. I mean, there were definitely some bigger ones where there were a lot of people in attendance, and the meeting ended up going really, really long. Usually the meetings at the beginning of the year would be a lot more involved because people had questions and people were trying to get to know each other.
I don't know, Mark. I think as the year went on and people developed, some conflicts with each other, I think the meetings would get more interesting as time went on, as people's patience with each other got shorter.
Because you just mentioned that, it makes me wonder, did you have like a certain period of time where there was like a great deal of move-ins all at once? Is that kind of marked by the university trimester system or semester system, or did you kind of have just people coming and going throughout the year?
No, it was definitely the big move-in time was in the late summer and fall. By the time the next summer rolled around, we'd have gone through a whole bunch of these like conflicts and the meetings kind of bulking up from people like working things out. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. That's, I mean, Mark may have a different memory, but I remember there being an excitement and enthusiasm, especially from new co-opers especially if they were younger, and this was a new experience for them being on their own. They were so excited to be in this place with these other people. There's fun people to talk to. You've got a responsibility. You're part of a group in a way that's I think particularly exciting when you're in your late teens and early 20s. But like anything else, time goes on, and sometimes you don't feel like doing bathrooms or hallways or whatever, and sometimes you don't get along with your roommate, and sometimes somebody does something, or there's a problem with parking or whatever, and then it comes before the house meeting, and I guess that's what I'm thinking of, is people developing conflicts and then those playing out. I don't want to overstate it. I don't want to create the impression that it was an unhappy place, but it's inevitable that people are going to have disagreements. And it was good that instead of getting into fights, they brought it to the board. I guess I remember sometimes, people would come to the board and they would start talking about an issue, and they would try to present it in very sort of broad terms. Maybe we should have a rule in the house that X, Y, Z, but you could see that it was really about some individual conflict they had with a person, and they were trying to frame it in terms of, a house policy.
Would you say that's a little bit like the Minnesota way to approach a conflict, or?
I think you could say that. I remember one incident in particular, and we could get off on a lot of little anecdotes, but somebody sort of art project that they were making, some sort of found art project in the living room, and that was fine. They had a space that they were working, and it consisted mostly of sticks and leaves and vines that they were sort of building into this little installation. Great, no problem. Well, the woman who had the job of cleaning up the living room, just did not understand what that was. And so she cleaned it up and threw it in the dumpster. And
oh no!
And then the artist came to the next board meeting and said, I think we ought to have a rule that if people are working on an art project in the living room, that they should be allowed to use that space, because there's not enough room in their rooms, and just this long sort of proposed rule. And I felt bad for it, but really,
but everyone's like, you're the artist, obviously, right?
Everyone, it was clearly about the fact that her installation got thrown in the dumpster because someone didn't understand that it was an art project. So.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that sounds very familiar indeed. So this kind of brings me to, you were talking about younger folks, and we're talking about housing equity, or housing equality, really, and I just wanted to know, what kinds of people were applying, and because I'm sure that some people would be chores, fines, credits. We don't do that, I'm not familiar with that culture of like using capitalism to kind of like move us around inside our own home. This is not for me. And what kind of people were like, oh, okay, this is for me. I'll try this. Did you notice a certain racial demographic, sexual demographic, anything like that?
Mark, do you want to start?
Wow. Well, it's a bit of a loaded question, and I want to answer in a respectful way.
Yeah, it's such a sensitive thing.
Well, and I'm afraid I'm probably going to answer in a way that's going to date me a little bit. There wasn't a a level of sensitivity around a lot of issues at that time in the 90s, the way that there is now. And so we weren't, I guess, on the front lines of some of the more difficult issues. But I do remember us really trying to, be open and have an open minds to other ways of looking at things, other ways of living our lives, and being, progressive to folks that were dealing with external pressures or disadvantages. There, honestly, I mean, the question of diversity is relative.
What you're saying is that it's kind of, the co-op was always had these things on. I think the difficult thing that we're trying to talk around is that the co-op culture attracts a certain demographic automatically.
Yes.
It's primarily white. It's primarily students. So
I think that's really it, Max. I mean, I think if you looked at the people who were there, it was diverse to a degree, as the university was. And had you gone back, if you went back in time and asked us at the time, what do you think about diversity in the co-op? We would have said that we're open to everybody. We welcome everybody here, regardless of their background. Now, the question of whether or not, walking into that place, you would feel more comfortable if you were a white kid from rural Minnesota, or whether you were, from an urban environment. I mean, that's a question that would require some more thought, and it's a fair question. But I think we made a sincere effort to make a welcoming house. And, there was people of different backgrounds. There was people from different ethnic backgrounds, from different countries, certainly from different economic backgrounds. I remember there was a guy who was in the co-op for a while. He was a former military guy, and his sort of attitudes, contrasted with other people in the co-op. It was very easy to see. But, everybody got along. So I guess that's what I would say. I think we did our best. Others might look at the diversity and say that we could have or should have done things differently, or that it wasn't a welcoming environment based upon subtle things that we didn't control, or you could say that. But there was a sincere effort on our part to create an open community where everybody was welcome.
If you don't mind a blunt question, how many people do you remember? Was it kind of like there was always one person of color or one Asian or like something like that? Did you see much, non-white students coming and going?
Yeah, there were non-white students. It wasn't just, Midwestern, white kids. There was diversity. People of Asian background, people of Middle Eastern background. It wasn't just your stereotype of a University of Minnesota student.
And I would have to add also that particularly during the summer, we had this organization that we were on the list of, and the organization was, I think, called BUNAC, and that was a acronym, and we used to refer to these students as BUNACers, and they were foreign students that would come over mostly from maybe the UK, and they would work a job here in the Twin Cities, and then go back to their home college maybe in the fall. So they were here mostly in the summer, and that added very much of an international cosmopolitan aspect to the co-op, particularly during the summer. And so it was really fun to live there in the summer when the BUNACers were there. I remember I was roommates with a fellow from India. I forgot his name already, but he was very forgiving. I was going through some difficult times at the time. And that was when I was up in room 18. He was my roommate. And I think he was a computer science major. And my friend Nick had some very good friends from the graduate department that would come over, and we would share meals. And a person that I became very, very close to, who was an instructor of mine actually, was from India. And so he, prepared Indian meals in the kitchen a few times, and he would always be watching television with us in the TV room, and he was super duper smart. It had a very international feel to it a lot of times, but especially in the summer. And I would say that it was usually pretty, the culture, even though it might have been diverse culturally, it had a pretty academic feel to it. even though it was culturally diverse.
Right. I can see that. Yeah.
And the diversity, we didn't have to deal with often with the really difficult issues of, economic diversity. And
right.
I mean, there were a few cases here and there, but our rent was really low. So it kind of made it possible for people to be there and get a lot out of the place. But we also really kind of tried to hold people to their responsibilities to the group. As long as people were kind of pulling their end, I guess, we didn't have to even worry too much about, subsidizing the situation because the rents were already pretty low and there was a very generous meal plan people could get on. There were ample opportunities. I mean, there were always opportunities to get credit for doing jobs too. Like I remember sometimes people would say, if you do my dishes for the quarter, I'll gladly pay the fines and you can get the credits and you can get all these credits towards your rent. So you could really live there very inexpensively. And that was one of the reasons I was able to, when I moved out of the co-op, I was able to move into a property ownership situation. I don't think I'm sharing too much.
Oh, because you were able to save. Yeah.
I was able to save. Exactly. I mean, and this is getting a little bit ahead of it, but I stopped taking classes and I continued living there and working a job, but contributing a lot to the house for a long time. But my costs were very low. So I was able to save a lot of money. And then I was able to put a down payment on a condominium and then move right into a place that I owned, which was
I get it. Yes.
For me.
So what I'm hearing is while you're there, there's all these invisible things going on. Like a person with less opportunity who's living there might just be scraping by. And when they move out, they might not have that same privilege of like being a homeowner right out of the students co-op. I know that I couldn't. Like when I was there, it kind of like it was priced so low that I was kind of priced right out of the housing market by the time I left the students co-op. And I'm still stuck in that situation at the moment. But yeah, no, that's very interesting and very insightful. Thank you for sharing all that. And also I wanted to get at the feeling of international exchange, because I also know that it's not just about the diversity in America, but the university also like cross-pollinates with universities and colleges around the world. So it's really cool to hear about that BUNAC program, and I'll probably look into that.
BUNAC, I want to say, is probably the acronym. I haven't looked that up.
Max, that was not happening when you were there. Is that correct? You didn't have international students coming in the summer?
Right. We've tried experimenting with things like couch surfing, and we did have a few couch surfing people. So that's a program where people can just come and stay for free. And we had them as boarders. So for example, we as roommates, Charlie and I were like, yeah, we will take the responsibility for including payments of whatever happens for these bicyclists that are like traveling and they just want to stay in our room. They stayed on the floor. It was really cramped. There was like 6 of us in room 6. It was very fun. But then the only thing they paid for was the boarding, i.e. the food. So then that was just something that we did, but we didn't really have, the international students were typically international students. I mean, they were just there year round going to the university. Uh-huh. We had Chinese nationals and someone from Somalia when I was there. And because I had not had that experience, I went to like a very privileged art school, MCAD. And there was some diversity, but not like I was seeing at the University of Minnesota. So that was very exciting for me.
So that's really interesting to me that you were a student at MCAD, but you were living at the students' co-op.
Well, I had graduated MCAD, and they had just gotten rid of the rule that you had to be a student to live there. So
gotcha.
Just to get back to this question of like credits and fines and things like that, to me, it sounds like that whole system, which was more or less the same system that I moved into in 2011 and changed only slightly by the time I moved out in 2015. It seemed like it lasted kind of as an egalitarian culture for some time. Do you remember how much of that was changed, or did you inherit it? Did you hear anything from the 80s about how much it had been different before you lived there?
I could say a few things. Ian, do you want to say anything, or should I just go ahead?
Well, I guess the one thing that I would say is Max, you hinted at a critique of that approach, which is, to reduce your participation in the community to dollars and cents is an impersonal and fundamentally a capitalist approach to what was supposed to be a intentional community where people succeed by contributing their time and their attention. And I understand the critique. However, I don't believe that there's a way out of it. I don't believe that there's a better way to run that type of community, because if you allow people to attempt to contribute in other ways, through sort of unquantified, cleaning or repairs or food preparation or things like this, the attempt to value those activities in a way that you can ensure that everyone's getting a fair deal, it becomes so difficult that I believe it's unfortunate, and it's a understandable critique, but I don't believe you can escape the monthly paying of rent, the fines for people who don't do what they're supposed to do, the credits for people who suffer, because somebody else didn't do their task. I think it's necessary.
I see your point. I mean, we're in the system where in order for the house to function, we have to pay taxes. So already we're plugged into this US fiat debt currency that we're all exchanging just to pool it together to give it to the tax man. So where's that going to come from? And how are you going to measure contributions to that? I think that like some intentional communities, outside of much more urban settings and much more strict settings plugged into like city governments and stuff, you can probably get away with something like chores or like your own inner currency. And you could even probably experiment with that at the Students Co-op. But I'm hearing you say that basically it's like tried and tested, at least through 2 or 3 decades of the Students Co-op history, if not further back.
Yeah. So you're hinting at an alternative of an intentional community in a rural setting, and this, you might call this a commune, or there's other terms for this. And I would argue that it's a poor model for the co-op, because at the co-op, you've got fundamentally people in an urban environment, whereas, as we say, most people are working jobs where they're paid. The house has to pay taxes. They have to interact with city government in specific ways. And most of the people there are going to be students. This is a transitional part of their lives. They're getting through school. That's quite different from somebody who's made a deliberate decision to move to an agrarian co-op and commit themselves and really their whole lifestyle to that kind of cooperative environment. And there's some interesting things about those environments, but I would argue that that's not the situation the co-op is in.
That makes sense. And Mark, I didn't mean to talk over you there too. If you wanted to,
no,
have any thoughts about this.
It's fascinating. I was doing a lot of talking earlier, so I'm really glad that. The only reason I'm on this call, really, is, to be honest, is because Ian reached out to me a little bit, and so I'm really thankful to Ian for doing that.
Visiting with Mark and Ian continues. Next episode, we'll talk a bit about how the co-op fits into a larger community of co-ops and a bunch of other fun stuff. I hope you'll tune in. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed the podcast and you want to check out the show notes, you can do so at maxime.com/co-op-pod, COOP-pod.